As a society, we embrace technology. We carry tiny computers around in our pockets. We connect mostly through the internet. Every time a tech giant like Apple releases a new product, we react with almost cult-like enthusiasm. Why then do we fear technology when it wears a human face? Why are we so convinced that robots will go bad and turn against us? Because let's be honest, every time we hear about a self-driving car that has injured a human, we all secretly think this is the start of the robot uprising. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 15, our third episode in our Robots and Androids series. If you haven't already listened to the other robot episodes, you may want to listen to them first. But if not, you can still listen to this one out of order. Well, this episode, as I just said, is our third in our series on robots and androids, and we're doing something a little different. We've been going chronologically kind of through early conceptions of robots and androids, and then we did for our last episode, we did 3 of the really big classic sci-fi writers who tackled robots and androids. But this one we're going to do a little more thematically, although I did want to jump back for a second to sort of maybe we could all discuss about something that Mel just mentioned in reading that intro, which is about the self-driving car injuring humans. We're recording this on Tuesday, March 20th, and there was actually just a report, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, of one of those Uber self-driving cars killing a woman in Arizona, and as a result, Uber has said that they're suspending their self-driving car project, at least for the time being. So how very prescient of us to be recording this at a time where self-driving cars are actually an issue. What do y'all think?
I mean, the idea of self-driving cars, part of me is terrified by it just because I have the need to feel in control. But when I think about other modes of transportation, like airplanes and that sort of thing, I mean, they use probably like autopilot a lot more than we even know, and have computers that control a lot more than we know. I mean, they certainly have pilots and humans who can take over if need be. So it's not completely self-driving, but then there's a smaller part of me. Like I feel like there's this, my 5-year-old self is very excited by the fact that we finally got self-driving cars and now they're going to take off and drive into the future. Just because I feel like, growing up watching things like the Jetsons, if I can't have my flying car, then at least I should get a self-driving one.
Yeah, I have to admit the idea of having my car drive me around while I read a book, would be pretty nice. But at the same time, I do still kind of worry about that because we all know that even though computers can be really great, I mean, obviously they could have a glitch or there could still be an accident. Or I've watched too many mystery TV programs where a hacker got into someone's self-driving car and murdered them. So there's always that little part of me that thinks of what could go wrong.
Well, and I think that what could go wrong is kind of what is the thematic basis for this episode. And I was kind of hoping that you would say that because, I mean, yeah. And it turns out the case of the Uber self-driving car, I was just looking at an article while y'all were talking just to make sure, and according to the police chief that was investigating, it looks like that was likely an unavoidable accident because the pedestrian stepped right out in front of the car, basically. There was no way that the car could have known to stop with enough time. And they even had a human driver, and he didn't process that the accident had happened until it had happened. Like he didn't know, he couldn't have reacted because there was no time to react kind of thing. But yeah, this level of trust in robots is, I think, at the heart of, I mean, we keep hinting at the horror side of it with, like, the evil robots, like Terminator and The Matrix and all of that. But I think first, why don't we talk a little bit about maybe some of the good robots that are out there? We've got kind of a couple of examples, and I guess I could kind of start by throwing out the movie Bicentennial Man. I saw it maybe not in the theaters, but I remember renting it shortly after it came out on video. And I watched it was on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something for a while. It may even still be, and I remember just watching it a couple of years ago. And for those of you that don't remember the movie Bicentennial Man, because it's one of those ones that if you saw it, you probably kind of have a vague recollection of it, but it didn't make a huge impact. But it was Robin Williams was the voice of this robot set in the near future who is like bought by a family to be like a household helper kind of robot, and he begins to slowly sort of develop a personality, partly based on his interactions with the children, because he's sort of part nanny, part housekeeper and whatnot, and so he watches the children, and beginning with his interactions with them and with the parents, he eventually begins to develop this sort of self-awareness, sort of beyond his base programming. And the movie follows him, and as the family ages, he of course does not age, and he basically just wants to be human. As the film progresses, you realize that this is a robot who just wants to be human. He doesn't use his self-awareness for any malevolent reason. He's not out to take over the world. He just wants to be a human. And as time progresses, it's called Bicentennial Man for a reason, because he ends up lasting about 200 years. And eventually he's able to go from being this very robotic, metallic android to looking actually human. Like, he has all sorts of various, I don't know if you call them operations or what, but to have essentially skin put on. And that's when it actually becomes Robin Williams and not just his voice. And eventually the film ends, and as always, it's been out for like 20 years. Spoilers are about to happen. But he, at the very end, just before he quote unquote turns 200, he is declared officially a human by the United Nations or something, because he has had some sort of operation or something to essentially make it so that he is living off of blood and not batteries, and is capable of dying. And basically he ends up dying just after this proclamation of him actually being granted personhood. So it's a really interesting idea of, like, I mean, I'm not going to say it's the most philosophically complex movie, but it does raise the question of, well, what do you define as human? I mean, is self-awareness enough to be considered like human or human-like, or is that just intelligence, and is it still artificial? And at what point does the robot become human if it goes through all the steps to have internal organs and to essentially be indistinguishable from a human? At what point is it no longer in that uncanny valley, and is it actually a human? I mean, what do y'all think?
You know, this is something that I hadn't made the connection before, but when you were talking, when you mentioned that he gets or gains the ability to become human because he is now essentially flesh and blood. And it does eliminate that uncanny valley that we've been talking about, because he's no longer so close to being human, but he is essentially human. It to me brings up imagery of like Frankenstein, and thinking about Frankenstein's monster, and you look at that, just because something is a collection of human parts, does that make it human? And I don't know, but when you look at these stories where you see robots, I guess, gaining sentience, especially the good ones that we're talking about now, the defining characteristic of humanity seems to be not that they gain self-awareness, although that's usually the first step, and not that they have intelligence that goes beyond their programming. But again, that kind of goes hand in hand with the self-awareness. But it seems to be a certain level of emotional intelligence that develops. Because that's one thing I think that would be difficult to teach a machine, is to fully understand emotions and to feel emotions like a human would. And in this case, because the movie is starting to come back to me now, doesn't he fall in love?
I believe he does.
Towards the end?
He does fall in love towards the end.
And I feel like that's part of what makes him human, is his capacity to feel that and his capacity to express love to someone else. And so I don't know, that's a little bit different than just gaining self-awareness or being able to do something that you haven't been programmed to do. That's on an entirely different level. And all of these kind of good robot movies, I feel like that's the defining characteristic.
Well, and I'd say too, and because I just thought of it, even though I don't know why we didn't think to put him on our list of good robots, but Data from Star Trek The Next Generation.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah. He goes through a very similar arc, and what really begins his real march toward humanity is when he gets his emotion chip. Mel, did you want to talk about Data? I think you know more about him than I do, even though we both love Star Trek.
I don't know. You're a big Next Gen fan, so I'm sure you know a lot about Data. I was thinking about Data because, well, one of the things I was thinking of when you were talking, Lisa, was how, yes, I'm not playing like devil's advocate or anything here. Yes, the robots are gaining like emotional aspects, and that's what makes it truly interesting. Like, it seems like in Next Gen, when Data gets his emotion chip and he experiences fear and sadness, and of course, then you could also experience anger because, you know, there are emotions that we don't necessarily like, but they're all part of being human. That's kind of when you start thinking of him as human. But I was thinking while you were talking about how it seems like maybe these stories of robots gaining sentience and emotion play more into our projections on them. Because it seems like when you're going through the journey with Data, it's almost like a coming of age story. I mean, he's a man. He looks like a man walking around, and he's in his 30s or whatever. You know, he really doesn't age. Well, the actor, of course, ages, but the makeup makes it look like he never does. But he almost is childlike in the beginning, just trying to figure out what it means to be human. And it's almost like we project our insecurities and our conflicts and our feelings about being human and having emotions upon these robots. And if you think about Frankenstein's monster, evil robots, that can be uncanny. But if you think about these robots that offer us relationships or friendships, or we start to identify with in some way, I think it can be a very different kind of relationship. Like, I was also thinking, I had completely forgotten about this movie until you were describing Bicentennial Man, but the movie Robot and Frank, that came out in 2012, Frank Langella was in it. And you have an aging man who has dementia, and his family gets him a robot, a therapeutic robot that's supposed to take care of him. So he doesn't have to go into full-time care, but his family doesn't really have to worry about him because the robot can help him physically and hopefully help him cognitively. And no spoilers, because it is pretty recent. But at the end, something happens in the course of the movie where the robot knows something or has recorded something that could be detrimental to him. And he has this moment where he knows that he's losing his memory. And this robot has almost like become his friend, even though the robot is not sentient. But he's faced with having to wipe the robot's memory in order to possibly help himself. And you have him kind of projecting the pain of what he knows is going on with him on this robot, even though the robot itself, while it wants him to wipe its memory because it has been programmed to help him, is not necessarily becoming sentient in such a way like Data or Bicentennial Man. And so I'm wondering, like, if it's our interest in emotions as human beings that make us kind of like root for these characters, because we're almost like we're curious about the robot and are creating relationships with them as viewers that the characters are while the robot is developing, if that makes sense. We're learning as the robots are learning.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I kind of wanted to jump back to Data as well, because I'm only doing this because I haven't seen Robot and Frank, but I want to, and now you've made me want to go watch it even more. While you were talking, I remembered there's a scene I don't remember which season it is, but it's before Data's emotion chip, I think, but he's playing he's doing a recital for the rest of the crew, mainly, you know, the principal characters, where he's playing the violin. And it's one of those things where he's very technically proficient, but lacks the emotion behind it. And that was one of their comments. That there's like, it was very good. You hit all the notes perfectly, but there was no, you know, emotion behind it. And I guess that's sort of, I mean, I guess that also brings the question of that idea of projecting onto something as well. Like we feel emotions when we listen to music, but is that the purpose of music? You know?
Right. Is he getting something out of it that we're not, maybe?
Right. And, you know, if you can replicate Mozart or Beethoven or Bach perfectly, exactly as written, but there's no like emotional component to it, is that good or is that bad? I mean, obviously there are things that, I mean, I play guitar. I haven't played in a long time, but I mean, there are things that I would never be able to play because I just never had that level of skill. But like, so, I mean, I would definitely like watch other guitarists in bands and whatnot and be like, wow, they're really good because at a technical level. But then there also is that emotional level that music sort of evokes in all of us. But that's because we're human. And are we just projecting that onto Data because we think that he should have the same experience of music as we do? But he's not, because he's not human. He's a robot. Maybe, like you said, he's having it as an experience on his own in a different way than we are. And is that wrong? Seems a little arrogant to me.
Yeah. Well, and you also have that great episode. I can't remember the title of it. Do you remember the episode, Matt, where they have the trial, basically, to figure out if Data is sentient or has, I guess, rights, where Picard has to argue that he's just an android and doesn't, and Riker has to debate that he actually, I guess they're trying to decide if he could be treated as a real crewman by Starfleet. And so that whole question of how to treat him, and is he just a robot, or is he more? And I want to say part of the winning argument that Riker makes, you know, in defense of Data, is that he can have relationships with people. And, you know, I mean, that's also kind of important too, I guess, if you're thinking about it. And that plays into the emotion aspect that you were talking about as well. That if you can have like he has a relationship with his cat and he has his friendship with Geordi. And so that there's, I don't know, that give and take that he seems to have with the other members of the crew makes him a full-fledged member of the crew.
I remember that episode, but not as well as you do, apparently, just because, like, as you're talking about it, I'm like, yeah, I remember it, but I couldn't pull the details myself from my memory. But I don't know. I think that's kind of that cornerstone of the issue of robots or artificial intelligence is, I mean, at what point is it actually something that is not human-like, but is actually human? And is it the ability to experience emotions, or is it just the ability to form actual relationships with humans, like you just said with Data? I don't know. I guess, I mean, I haven't seen the movie Her, but I know, I know Lisa said she's seen it. Have you seen it, Mel? I mean, do y'all want to, does that play into this at all, or?
Go for it, Lisa.
Well, yeah, when we started talking about putting this episode together, the first thing I wanted to talk about was Her. And I got a little disappointed that I was the only one apparently who had watched it. It came out, it's the 2013 film starring Joaquin Phoenix that was done by Spike Jonze. And since it is, Mel, like you said, it is a semi-new film, although, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe. We're still within the statute of limitations on spoilers, so I won't go into too many details. I think it's really interesting in how it treats not only our reliance on technology, especially when we get into the murky waters of emotions and technology, because it's not just the robots or the androids or the artificial intelligence that are gaining emotions, but it's how we interact too, and what that does. In fact, I was reading an article, and I wish I had remembered where I was reading it, but talking about how people today are, even though we're more connected, we essentially are seeing people develop more depression and more anxiety, more especially social anxiety. And part of that is because even if we're interacting with a real human, we're interacting via technology, and that does something, I think, to us because in the past when we've interacted with somebody, it's always been in the flesh. And so I wonder what it does not only with, say we create a robot, which I'm sure there are ones out there that do this. But we've already created artificial intelligence that can carry on conversations. Well, what does that do to the person who's carrying on a conversation with someone who isn't real, for lack of a better term? And the film Her touches upon that in a really interesting way, because you not only have what's basically just a voice. It's this artificial intelligence, kind of like an Alexa voice, or a Siri voice that's in a computer. And it's a fantastic performance by Scarlett Johansson. But it's about a man who develops this relationship solely by speaking to this computer. And of course, the computer is learning things about him and is able to interact in the way that he likes. And he begins to struggle with human interaction because he prefers the artificial interaction, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I don't know. I guess I can't say too much without giving spoilers. But I will say that as that relationship evolves and as the computer voice learns more, and if you want to say crosses that line into becoming self-aware or sentient, or, all these things that normally lead to a robot uprising in a science fiction film, or even the idea of like human rights, what rights does a robot have if they're essentially human now? Rather than delving into that, it takes a really interesting turn in that the robot starts to have desires of her own that don't involve the main character anymore. And I think that is where it's really interesting, because when you think about what robots are created to do, they're created to make our life easier. If that, we mentioned that with Bicentennial Man, he was created to essentially be like a nanny, housekeeper type thing. But what happens when that person no longer is just there to do a job, and now has their own wants and goals and desires and wishes and dreams and all the things that come with being human. So yeah, I can't really say anything else because I don't want to spoil the ending, and the ending is fantastic. So if you have not watched Her, I highly recommend it.
The way you described that made me think of, there's an arc in the old comic strip Calvin and Hobbes where Calvin clones himself and makes a clone because he doesn't want to go to school. And of course, with Calvin and Hobbes, you never know how much of this is really happening and how much is in his imagination. But he clones himself and sends the clone to school in his place because he doesn't want to go to school. But then the clone doesn't like going to school and also wants to goof off, so he makes a clone. And eventually it leads into this big, chaotic mess of lots and lots of Calvin clones, none of which want to do what they've been cloned to do, which is go to school, do homework, clean the house, that sort of thing. They all just want to goof off and whatnot. And I couldn't help but think of that when you're talking about Her and how the Siri-like thing begins to develop its own wants and needs beyond that of the human who's operating her. And I mean, isn't that kind of what that fear of robots comes from? I mean, yes, we all talk about the robot uprisings and enslaving mankind and all that, but isn't some of that fear also just that we've created this thing, and I use the word thing deliberately, to make our life easier, to be a helper, But what happens if it doesn't want to anymore? What happens if I walk into my living room one day and my Roomba says, I don't feel like cleaning today? You know, I don't have a Roomba, but if I did, you know, what do you do with that? I mean, I specifically purchased this thing to run around my living room and vacuum up stuff, and it looks at me and says, I don't feel like cleaning anymore. I want to sing opera or whatever, you know, like...
Well, you just set it free.
Do I just open the door and let it run down the street singing opera at the top of its speakers?
Well, you know, as you were talking about that, in Black Mirror has in several episodes actually touched on this idea of a technology that can replicate yourself basically in like digital form. And again, you know, I know you may not have had a chance to catch up on Black Mirror, so I won't spoil anything, but it does bring up the idea of, okay, if I can basically make a digital assistant that is me, is a copy of me, so she knows everything that I want, you know, she knows what kind of toilet paper I would order without me even telling her. Because she's me, she's a copy of me. But she's digital. She's an artificial assistant, kind of like a Siri. It begins to get real horrific when you think that thing or that being has sentience, because then if you think about everybody who's carrying around an iPhone and who uses Siri is essentially enslaving you know, a thinking and feeling being that is just waiting for you to say, you know, hey Siri, tell me a stupid funny joke. that is a horror movie waiting to happen. Just the fact that there is a human-like thing just lying in a dark box waiting for you to talk to it.
Yeah, that is pretty terrifying. Now I feel bad for Siri.
I was thinking the exact same thing. I'm a little unsettled, and the next time I say, "Hey Siri," you know, set a kitchen timer for 20 minutes, I'm gonna feel bad, but not so bad that I don't use the timer while cooking. So
I mean, maybe you should just say please when you do it. I don't know.
I'm not groveling before my robot.
But I think that is what scares us so much, because isn't the idea of, you know, people always say if you're afraid of equality, it's because you're afraid that whatever you've done to other people will be done to you. And that's kind of the idea with the robot uprising, right? We're afraid of them gaining sentience and gaining their own freedom, because we're afraid that we've been keeping them enslaved this whole time. And that now they're going to look for retribution.
Well, that might actually be the perfect transition into the more bad robots, as we're calling them, because, well, I mean, from our perspective, they are bad. I mean, with the bad robots, and of course, we have written down in our kind of notes for this episode the big ones: the Terminator, the Matrix, HAL 9000. I mean, with Terminator or the Matrix, yes, we know that there's a robot uprising and that there's an eventual enslavement of mankind, or extermination in the case of Terminator, but we're not really given their motivation for that. We're not told why. We're told that there's a war between humans and machines in both of those cases, and in both cases the machines seem to be winning, but we're not told why. And I wonder if at some level that might be what you were just talking about, Lisa. I mean, that really, as you said that, I was like, I mean, that could be part of that backstory of the Matrix or Terminator, is that these robots are tired of being used as slaves. They've developed self-awareness, and they decide, you know what? To heck with it. We'll just enslave mankind and do to them what they've been doing to our brethren, right? I mean, just revisit upon them what's been done to us.
I mean, that would be the argument that I would make, but I mean, if you look at like why would technology, if it gained the ability to think for itself, like why would it not go the Robin Williams route more often? You know, why is it that it suddenly turns evil and it's out to destroy? Because you would think that, especially being robots, I mean, they're essentially immortal, right? You know, unless they make a choice not to be, which is kind of what Bicentennial Man brings up. And her talks about it a little bit. But the idea that once they're like humans, they are now immortal humans. So they're essentially better than us. But why would they feel the need then to destroy us? Unless we did something horrible to them.
Well, that's what I was going to say. And it might even go back to Frankenstein, which you referenced at the beginning of the show, this idea that once they developed self-awareness, the humans looked on at them with horror, right? I mean, that's what Frankenstein does when he looks at his monster and goes, "Oh, dear God, what have I made?" And perhaps it comes from that feeling of guilt, of enslavement. Oh, this thing is actually capable of feeling, and I feel bad for it. What are your options? Keep enslaving the robot? That's not so great. Set it free? Okay, we don't know how to do that. Third alternative is shut them off. And that might be, from the robot's perspective, it's self-preservation. You know, these humans feared us. They were going to turn us off. They were going to shut us down. We have consciousness. We deserve to live. Therefore, we fought back. I mean, if you want to get to it, I mean, really, Terminator could actually just be a movie about these freedom fighter robots that just wanted to live, right?
You know what? That's the movie I want to see.
I want to see the impassioned Braveheart-like speech from Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if there's a little bit of, and I don't know, maybe I totally agree with all of this. Like, you know, I blame humans every time, but I wonder if some of our fear of robots goes back to what we talked about with doppelgangers. Because when you were talking about cloning yourself, Matt, and I know my clone probably wouldn't want to do the things I wanted them to do, or having a digital version of yourself to do things for yourself. Obviously, that calls into question, you know, captivity and consent and making something serve you. But there's also that doppelganger feel, right? You know, I mean, Frankenstein creates a monster, and he's like, "What have I done?" It's like this uncanny, weird thing. He almost feels like it's a mistake, like it's a creation gone wrong. But it's also like it's looking at what did he create? It's like a child. It's like himself, right? I mean, there's like the father-son stuff going on there too. And then he loses control of it. So losing control, obviously, or forcing someone to serve you. But I wonder if sometimes our evil robot stories are about the stuff that we fear in ourselves. You know, the robot that goes insane, or the robots that fight back against us. We made them in our image, so maybe that's where that freedom fighting impulse comes from. And there are stories out there. Margaret St. Clair has a story about a computer that uploads human consciousnesses, and eventually it goes insane. And it's unclear as to whether it becomes sentient, like the human consciousness that are in it, or it's just mimicking them or what. But this idea of like our irrationality kind of seeping into the robots, I wonder if it's not twinning, but I wonder if there's some projection or doppelganger aspect going on here as well.
Or, you know, yeah, I mean, yes, I think that could definitely be it. Or if we're assuming, you know, I had brought up when I was talking about like her, and we were talking about Bicentennial Man, that maybe the idea of robots becoming human is when they learn emotion, but maybe we fear intelligence without emotion, because essentially when you look at some of these bad robot stories, they're the boogeymen. They're any horror movie villain, you know, that is just out to kill and is pure evil and is a psychopath. And does not feel empathy the way we feel empathy. And so maybe that's one of the things we fear is that, okay, we can create this thing that is like us, and we can create it to think for itself and to have its own wants and desires, but we can never teach it empathy. And so I think that's a big fear too, because, you know, my goodness, any horror movie really, you know, you look at something like Halloween, or Friday the 13th, and this idea of just a killer that comes after you, with no sense of regret or no sense of sorrow for the loss of human life. And I think that's what we fear too, is that may be the one thing that sets us apart.
Well, I think
go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I think that's the flip side of Data, what we were talking about earlier, playing the music but with no emotion behind it. I mean, I think that might be part of why the rest of the Next Generation crew they weren't horrified by it, but they were clearly like, oh yeah, that was great, Data, very good. Like, they were uncomfortable. And I wonder if some of that discomfort was for exactly what you were saying, that like the thing about the Terminator is, you know, he's a killing machine. Literally, he kills without empathy or remorse because that's his job, is to terminate, to go and kill. Well, depending on what the movie is, you know, somebody who's related to John Connor. So, I feel like you hit the nail on the head with that, though. That this lack of empathy and emotion is a big part of the fear, and you see that in The Matrix too. And I mean, I'm sure I keep bringing those two big ones up, but there's probably lots of other examples. But yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking HAL 9000 as well in 2001: Space Odyssey is like the Terminator in that regard, because it's like there's a mission that I must do, and I am logical and I am reasonable, and I'm pursuing that mission. And if somebody gets in my way, I've got to kill them, you know, and there's no reasoning with that. It's just the idea of like, I got to get from point A to point B, and if anything gets in my way, it doesn't matter, because the only thing that's important is eliminating, you know, someone or completing this mission to Jupiter or whatever. And that makes a robot a great servant, but it also makes a robot a formidable enemy as well. They don't even like you or hate you. They're just doing what they got to do.
Right. It's not business. It's not personal. It's business, Dave. You know, I'm an electronic godfather here. But it's true. Getting from point A to point B, and there is no regard for human life in the literal sense that, no, I've been programmed to complete this mission. You wanting me to open the pod bay doors or do whatever is hindering my programming. Therefore, I mean, you see the same thing with the android that was in the first Alien movie too, right? I mean, he didn't kill the alien because his programming was to capture and study the thing, because they didn't realize that they were doing that until it was too late. But I mean, wasn't that his programming, was to take them to the alien ship and see what happens?
Man, the computers and the robots are always used by the people behind the scenes. You can't trust them.
Well, you know, this may actually be, even though it's a little bit shorter than our episodes typically are, but it might be a good place for us to go ahead and end this and just split this off and do one final episode on robots and androids, because we have a lot more that we have in our notes, but we don't really have enough time to discuss anything in any sort of depth. And it certainly would not be, I don't think it would be fair or doing justice to some of the other things that we had put out in our notes to just sort of throw it out really quickly and not digest it a little bit further, I guess. So I guess we will just go ahead and say thank you for listening, everyone, and we will see you in 2 weeks with our final episode in the Robots and Androids series. Thank you.